The man who walked past the shadow. Harlem did not sleep the way other neighborhoods slept. Even in the early hours before dawn, when the streetlights buzzed and the last train rattled underground, the air still carried memory. The bricks remembered footsteps, the windows remembered arguments and laughter. The sidewalks remembered men who once stood tall and fell quietly. And somewhere between memory and silence, a shadow lingered, not as a ghost, but as a question. His name was Isaiah Carter. Isaiah had grown up hearing it whispered, not taught in school, not written in textbooks, but spoken in barbershops, in back rooms, in the pauses between sentences when old men stopped talking and stared at the floor. Back then, they'd say, things were different. Isaiah never asked who made them different. He already knew. But this story is not about the man whose shadow people still argued over. This story is about what that shadow does to the living. Isaiah worked nights as a subway maintenance supervisor, not because he loved the job, but because it paid steady and kept him invisible. Invisible men survive longer in places like Harlem. He wore the same dark jacket every night, the same boots scuffed from years underground, and the same expression, calm, unreadable, careful. He was 38 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like someone who had learned early that showing too much emotion invited trouble. People often mistook him for cold. In truth, he was observant. His mother used to say, "Boy, you got eyes that listen." She had passed 5 years earlier, quietly in a small apartment overlooking Lenox Avenue. Isaiah still lived there, same furniture, same chipped coffee mug, same framed photograph of her smiling in a church hat that had been slightly too big for her head. She had raised him alone. And she had raised him with one rule that mattered more than all others. Power doesn't shout, Isaiah. Power decides. She never explained where she learned that. On this particular night, Isaiah finished his shift just before 4 a.m. The station was empty except for a janitor humming softly and a security guard sipping cold coffee. Isaiah nodded to them and climbed the stairs out into the street. Harlem breathed around him. A police cruiser passed slowly. A woman dragged a grocery cart down the sidewalk. A neon sign flickered like it had been doing the same tired dance for decades. As Isaiah walked, he felt it again, that strange sensation he'd noticed more often lately. The sense that he wasn't alone, even when no one was there. Not fear, not paranoia, just awareness. He stopped near a closed storefront with metal shutters tagged in old graffiti. The paint was faded, layered over itself like history trying to erase and failing. "You feel it too, don't you?" The voice came from behind him. Isaiah turned calmly. The man standing there was old, 70s at least, dressed in a long wool coat despite the mild weather. His face was lined like a map, and his eyes were sharp in a way that made Isaiah straighten slightly, without knowing why. "Feel what?" Isaiah asked. The old man smiled faintly. "The weight." Isaiah said nothing. The man stepped closer, tapping the sidewalk with his cane. "This neighborhood," he said, "it remembers more than people think. Some men leave buildings, some men leave shadows." Isaiah studied him. "You talking history or superstition?" The old man chuckled. "I'm talking consequences." They stood there in silence for a moment. Then the old man nodded once, as if satisfied, and walked away down the street, disappearing into the early morning haze. Isaiah watched him go. That was the first time the shadow spoke to him directly. Later that day, Isaiah couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, coffee untouched, staring at the wall where his mother's photograph hung. He remembered the way she used to pause when his questions got too close to the past. "Ma," he'd asked once as a teenager. Why people still talk about him like he's here? She looked at him carefully. Because some men change the rules, she said, and when rules change, echoes last. Was he a hero? Isaiah asked. She shook her head. Heroes don't leave confusion behind. That answer followed Isaiah into adulthood. By afternoon, Harlem was awake. Kids played stickball in the street. Music spilled from open windows. Isaiah walked toward the community center where he volunteered twice a week, tutoring teenagers who reminded him too much of himself, smart, restless, and quietly angry. Inside, the walls were lined with murals of black leaders, artists, and activists. Noticeably absent was the face people still whispered about. One of the boys, Malik, leaned back in his chair and asked, "Mr. Carter, you think a man can really change a whole place?" Isaiah considered the question. "Yes," he said finally, "but the question is what kind of change he leaves." Malik smirked. "My uncle says back in the day, at least people were afraid to mess with you." Isaiah leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Fear isn't respect. Fear is debt, and somebody always pays." The room went quiet. That night, Isaiah dreamed, not of violence, not of gunfire, not of glory. He dreamed of walking through Harlem as it once was, jazz pouring from clubs, men in suits arguing on corners, women laughing too loudly. And standing at the center of it all was a figure he could never quite see clearly. Every time Isaiah tried to look directly at him, the figure turned away. But he felt the presence, heavy, commanding, unfinished. When Isaiah woke, his heart wasn't racing. It was heavy. The next morning, Isaiah received a call from the community center director. Funding was being cut. Programs would close. Kids would be pushed back onto the streets with nothing but time and anger. Isaiah stood by his window, looking out over Harlem. He understood something then. The shadow wasn't about one man. It was about what filled the space he left behind. Silence can be dangerous. So can memory. And Isaiah realized, with a clarity that frightened him, that he was standing at a crossroads Harlem had seen before. One path led to dominance, the other to responsibility, and the shadow was watching. When silence starts asking for answers. Harlem had a way of testing people without announcing the test. It did not send letters or warnings, and it did not care how prepared you thought you were. It simply applied pressure, slowly at first, then all at once, until whatever was hidden inside a person began to show. Isaiah felt that pressure building in the days after the funding cut announcement, not as fear, but as a steady tightening in his chest that refused to go away. Everywhere he walked, he noticed the same patterns repeating themselves, the same corners gathering the same restless young men, the same arguments flaring and dissolving without resolution, the same quiet understanding that something was missing and no one quite knew what should replace it. The community center tried to keep its doors open as long as possible, but the signs of collapse were everywhere. Broken equipment went unrepaired. Volunteers stopped showing up as their own lives demanded attention elsewhere. The kids noticed before anyone admitted it out loud. And kids, Isaiah knew, reacted to uncertainty in predictable ways. Some became louder, testing boundaries, daring adults to stop them. Others grew quiet, slipping back into themselves as if bracing for impact. Malik, usually sharp-tongued and energetic, had begun arriving late and leaving early, his eyes always drifting toward the window as though the street outside was calling him back. One evening, after most of the others had gone, Malik lingered near the door, pretending to scroll on his phone while clearly waiting for something. Isaiah pretended not to notice until the silence became too heavy to ignore, then finally asked what was on his mind.
Malik hesitated, then shrugged in that practiced way young men used when they didn't want to admit they were scared. He said people on the block were talking, saying things were about to change, that when programs disappeared, somebody always stepped in to fill the gap. And Isaiah heard the unspoken question buried beneath the words. Who would step in this time, and what would they want in return? That question followed Isaiah home and refused to leave. He thought about his mother again, about the way she used to watch the neighborhood from the same window he now stood beside, never interfering, never panicking, but never looking away either. She had believed that awareness was a form of protection, that pretending not to see was how people ended up trapped in patterns they didn't choose. Isaiah wondered what she would say now, watching Harlem edge closer to a familiar kind of instability, the kind that invited strong personalities and simple answers, the kind that made complicated problems feel solvable through force of will alone. The next sign came in the form of an invitation that wasn't really an invitation at all. A man Isaiah vaguely recognized from the neighborhood approached him outside the subway station one night, smiling too easily, talking too comfortably, as if they were old friends rather than strangers circling each other cautiously. He spoke about respect, about order, about how the streets needed structure again, and how certain people were already stepping up to provide it. He didn't threaten Isaiah, didn't raise his voice or make demands, but the implication was clear enough to make Isaiah's jaw tighten. There were people who believed Harlem needed a familiar kind of authority, and they were curious whether Isaiah would be an obstacle or an asset. Isaiah declined politely and walked away, but the encounter left him shaken in a way he didn't expect. Not because he felt endangered, but because he recognized the logic being used. He had heard it before, filtered through older voices and softened by nostalgia, the argument that fear kept chaos in check, and that peace required someone willing to carry the weight others avoided. It was the same argument that turned complicated history into a simplified legend, the same reasoning that transformed shadows into symbols of strength instead of warnings. That night, sleep came slowly, and when it did, the dream returned. Harlem again, alive and crowded, full of movement and noise, but this time Isaiah wasn't alone. He stood among people who looked to him expectantly, their faces blurred, but their attention unmistakable. And somewhere just beyond them stood the shadow, not speaking, not moving, simply present. Isaiah understood then that the shadow wasn't demanding imitation or obedience. It was asking a single, relentless question. What would you do if they started listening to you? The realization unsettled him more than any threat could have. Power, Isaiah understood, did not arrive fully formed. It emerged quietly, through trust, through presence, through the willingness to remain when others stepped back. He had never wanted that kind of responsibility, never imagined himself as someone others would look to for answers. Yet the absence of leadership around him was creating a vacuum, and vacuums, history taught him, were never left empty for long. The following week, the community center officially announced its closure. There were no speeches, no protests, just a short notice taped to the front door, and a lock that clicked into place with a finality that echoed louder than any argument. Isaiah stood across the street, watching kids gather, read the sign, and drift away in different directions, each carrying a private version of disappointment. In that moment, he felt anger rise, not explosive or reckless, but focused and heavy, the kind of anger that demanded action rather than release. He began to understand that the shadow haunting Harlem was not tied to one man's past deeds, but to an unresolved question the neighborhood kept asking itself. Was safety something imposed from above, or something built collectively from below? Could authority exist without fear, and could respect survive without intimidation? These questions were not theoretical to Isaiah. They were immediate, urgent, and personal. because the answers would shape the lives of people he cared about. Isaiah started small, intentionally so. He began organizing informal study sessions in his apartment, inviting a few kids at a time, keeping things quiet and focused. He reached out to parents, to local shop owners, to people who still believed that community was not an abstract idea, but a daily practice. He didn't promise protection or control, didn't pretend he could fix everything, but he offered consistency. And consistency, he discovered, was rarer than charisma and far more powerful. As weeks passed, word spread, not through announcements or speeches, but through observation. People noticed that kids who spent time with Isaiah stayed out of trouble longer. They noticed arguments de-escalating instead of exploding, small disputes resolved through conversation rather than posturing. They noticed that Isaiah never raised his voice and never backed down, a combination that made people listen whether they intended to or not. And still, the shadow lingered. Isaiah felt it most strongly during moments of doubt, when exhaustion made shortcuts seem tempting, and nostalgia whispered that things had once been simpler, even if they had also been crueler. In those moments, he remembered his mother's words and understood them more fully than ever before. "Power decides," she had said, "not who you fear, but who you protect." Harlem was watching him now, quietly, the way it always watched before choosing to trust someone. And Isaiah knew the real test was still ahead, because choosing a different path did not erase the old one. It challenged it. It invited comparison. And shadows, when challenged, often grew darker before they faded.
The weight of being watched. By the time Isaiah understood that Harlem had begun to quietly organize itself around him, the realization came not with pride, but with a sense of gravity that pressed down on his shoulders every time he stepped outside. It showed itself in subtle ways rather than grand gestures, in how shop owners greeted him with longer conversations, in how parents asked his opinion before making decisions about their children, and in how certain street corners grew quieter when he passed, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. This was the most dangerous stage, Isaiah knew, the moment when people stopped testing and started expecting, when influence became responsibility, whether it was requested or not. The pressure intensified the night a disagreement between two local families threatened to spiral into something larger. It began, as these things often did, with a misunderstanding over property boundaries and accusations layered with old resentment. But beneath the surface, Isaiah sensed something deeper at work. The absence of formal community structures had left unresolved tensions exposed, and some people, impatient with slow solutions, were eager for a decisive figure to step in and impose order. They didn't say it openly, but Isaiah could hear it in the way they spoke, the way their voices hardened when they talked about respect being lost and discipline needing to be restored. Isaiah listened without interrupting, letting the weight of their expectations settle fully before responding. He did not raise his voice or promise quick resolutions. Instead, he asked questions, careful ones, questions that forced people to confront not just what they wanted to happen, but what they were willing to live with afterward. He asked them how they wanted their children to remember this moment, whether they wanted peace born from understanding or silence born from intimidation, and those questions unsettled them more than any threat could have. Some grew frustrated, accusing Isaiah of being naive, of misunderstanding how things had always worked in Harlem. But others grew thoughtful, their anger deflating as they realized no one had ever asked them to imagine a future beyond winning the argument at hand. That night, after the dispute de-escalated without spectacle or force, Isaiah walked home alone through streets that felt heavier than usual. The shadow followed him more closely now, no longer distant or abstract, but present in every choice he made.
He felt it when he wondered whether he should have been firmer, when he questioned whether patience would hold under greater strain, when he worried that restraint might be mistaken for weakness. The shadow was not tempting him to act violently or dominate others. It was tempting him to simplify, to believe that control could replace trust and that authority could exist without accountability. The dreams returned, more vivid than before, and in them Isaiah stood not in the past, but in a future that felt uncomfortably close. He saw Harlem divided into neat lines of order and silence, efficient and calm on the surface, but hollow underneath, the laughter muted and the creativity constrained. He understood then that the shadow's greatest danger was not chaos, but stagnation, the slow erosion of humanity that came when people were managed instead of empowered. When he woke, Isaiah felt a clarity settle over him, calm but resolute, the kind that came only after confronting a truth that could no longer be ignored. Word of Isaiah's approach began spreading beyond the immediate neighborhood, drawing attention from people who viewed his influence not as a community effort, but as a challenge to older assumptions about leadership. Some approached him cautiously, curious whether his calm authority could be redirected toward their own agendas, while others observed from a distance, waiting for him to fail so they could point to his restraint as proof that stronger measures were necessary. Isaiah recognized this dynamic instinctively, understanding that true opposition often hid behind patience rather than confrontation, waiting for the right moment to assert itself. The defining test came when a public meeting was called to address growing concerns about safety and order in the area. The room was crowded, tense with unspoken disagreements, and Isaiah felt the collective gaze settle on him the moment he entered. People expected a speech, a declaration, perhaps even a promise that he would become the kind of figure history had taught them to recognize, someone decisive and unyielding. Instead, Isaiah spoke quietly, deliberately, framing the discussion not around fear or control, but around shared responsibility and mutual accountability. He acknowledged the anxiety in the room without validating the impulse to surrender agency to a single authority, emphasizing that any solution built on intimidation would eventually demand a price the community could not afford. The reaction was mixed, as Isaiah anticipated it would be. Some applauded, relieved to hear a vision that preserved dignity without denying reality, while others shook their heads, unconvinced that such an approach could withstand the pressures Harlem inevitably faced. What mattered to Isaiah was not unanimous approval, but the shift he observed in how the conversation unfolded. People began addressing each other instead of talking past one another, began proposing collaborative solutions instead of demanding enforcement. And for the first time since the community center closed, Isaiah sensed momentum building in a direction that did not rely on fear as its foundation. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, an older man approached Isaiah, his expression unreadable but his posture respectful. He spoke quietly, acknowledging that he had lived through earlier eras when order came at the cost of freedom and silence masked deep wounds. He told Isaiah that shadows only held power when people refused to imagine alternatives, and that challenging them required not strength alone, but endurance. Isaiah listened, recognizing in the man's words an echo of his mother's wisdom, passed down through lived experience rather than theory. Walking home that night, Isaiah realized that the shadow haunting Harlem was beginning to change shape. It no longer loomed as a singular presence, but fractured into questions, doubts, and memories that lost cohesion when examined honestly. He understood that this transformation did not mean the struggle was over, only that its nature had shifted. Leadership, he learned, was not about defeating shadows, but about refusing to become one, about choosing visibility, accountability, and humility, even when darkness offered simpler paths. Harlem was still watching, still testing, still remembering, but it was also learning, slowly and unevenly, that its future did not have to be dictated by its past. Isaiah felt the weight of that possibility settle into something steadier, less burdensome, and for the first time since the shadow had begun to follow him, he allowed himself a cautious sense of hope. The real haunting, he realized, was not the presence of history, but the fear of outgrowing it. And as long as he continued to choose responsibility over dominance, the shadow would remain what it always should have been, a reminder rather than a ruler.
What remains after the shadow moves on. The moment that finally defined Isaiah Carter did not arrive with noise, confrontation, or spectacle, but with a quiet crisis that forced Harlem to reveal what it had learned from watching him. It began when a city redevelopment proposal surfaced unexpectedly, promising investment and modernization, while quietly threatening to displace families who had lived in the neighborhood for generations. The language of the proposal was polished and optimistic, filled with phrases about progress and opportunity, but Isaiah recognized the familiar pattern beneath it, the kind that had reshaped Harlem before by removing people rather than empowering them. Fear spread quickly, not the sharp kind that caused panic, but a slow, creeping anxiety that whispered of inevitability and reminded residents how often decisions had been made about them rather than with them. In earlier eras, this kind of moment would have produced a single dominant voice, someone who claimed to negotiate on behalf of everyone while consolidating influence behind closed doors. Many people, exhausted and uncertain, looked to Isaiah with that expectation lingering just beneath the surface, waiting to see whether he would step forward as a lone representative, a gatekeeper between Harlem and forces larger than itself. Isaiah felt the temptation clearly, the ease with which he could accept that role, speak with authority, and become the focal point of resistance or compromise. The shadow pressed close then, offering efficiency disguised as leadership, reminding him how quickly outcomes could be achieved when power flowed through a single channel. Instead, Isaiah chose the harder path, one that required patience, vulnerability, and trust in others. He organized open forums rather than private meetings, insisting that discussions remain public, inclusive, and sometimes uncomfortably slow. He encouraged residents to speak for themselves, even when their voices shook or their arguments collided, believing that dignity emerged from participation rather than protection. The process was messy, frustrating, and imperfect, but it carried a weight that unilateral decisions never could, because it belonged to everyone involved. Isaiah did not position himself at the center. He positioned himself as a facilitator, steady and present, guiding without controlling. As weeks passed, something remarkable happened, something Harlem had rarely experienced in moments of pressure. The community began to act collectively, forming committees, consulting legal aid organizations, and engaging city officials with clarity and persistence. They disagreed often, sometimes fiercely, but they remained engaged, refusing to retreat into silence or surrender agency out of fear. Isaiah watched this transformation with quiet pride, understanding that his greatest success was not in being followed, but in making himself increasingly unnecessary. The shadow that had once loomed over him now struggled to find form, its influence diluted by shared responsibility and collective action. One evening, as negotiations reached a critical stage, Isaiah walked alone through the neighborhood, noticing details he had overlooked before. He saw murals being repainted with fresh colors, children practicing music on stoops, elders sitting together discussing strategy rather than reminiscing about lost authority. Harlem felt alive in a different way, less reactive and more intentional, as though it had begun to trust itself again.
The air still carried memory, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt instructive, reminding rather than warning. Isaiah thought again of his mother, of the lessons she had imparted without sermons or dramatics, and he realized that her influence, like the shadow he had wrestled with, was never about dominance. It was about steadiness, about showing up consistently and refusing to let fear dictate values. He understood then that ghosts only haunted places where people believed they had no choice, where history was treated as destiny rather than context. Harlem, through its collective effort, had begun to prove otherwise. The final agreement with the city was not perfect, but it preserved homes, protected community spaces, and ensured that development included those who already belonged there. More importantly, it established a precedent demonstrating that Harlem could advocate for itself without relying on singular figures or inherited myths of power. When the announcement was made, there were no grand celebrations, just quiet relief and a shared understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The neighborhood had not been saved by a shadow or a hero, but by its own willingness to evolve. In the weeks that followed, Isaiah noticed that people approached him differently. They still respected him, still sought his perspective, but the dependency he had once sensed was gone, replaced by confidence and initiative. He felt lighter, not because his responsibility had diminished, but because it had been redistributed among many capable hands. Leadership, he learned, reached its highest form when it dissolved into collective strength rather than crystallizing around a single identity. One night, standing at his window, Isaiah looked out over Harlem and felt the absence of the presence that had followed him for so long. The shadow had not vanished completely. It had settled into history, into lessons acknowledged rather than feared. It no longer asked questions or demanded comparison. It simply existed, contained by understanding. Isaiah realized that this was the true resolution, not the erasure of the past, but its integration into a future that refused to repeat its mistakes. Harlem was no longer haunted, not because it had forgotten, but because it had remembered correctly. The ghost that once lingered had transformed into wisdom, and the shadow that once threatened to guide decisions had been replaced by shared vision. Isaiah turned away from the window, ready to rest, knowing that the neighborhood's story would continue without him at the center, stronger for it. And in that quiet certainty, he found the answer to the question that had followed him from the beginning. The shadow only ruled when people stood beneath it. Once they stepped forward together, it became nothing more than a reminder of how far they had come.